Since 1750, we've been living through the Great Acceleration. Energy use, population, and emissions have all followed an exponential curve. We are reshaping the Earth at breakneck speed. And yet, beneath it all, we remain the same old species. We are apes with godlike powers. Which brings me to the third question. Where are we going? Ask the CEOs of the big tech companies and they'll tell you that the rise of artificial intelligence is 100 times bigger than the Industrial Revolution. That this may be the last invention we'll ever make. We are currently in a race to create alien minds, systems that we do not understand and that we may not be able to control. They are not designed so much as summoned into being. And so we must ask, will this be the new worst mistake in the history of the human race? Hello, I'm Rutger Bregman. My fourth and final BBC Reith Lecture is by far my most personal. I'm going to talk about my own philosophical journey and outline my fears for the future. And I warn that big tech is now out of control and threatening our very humanity. I've called it Fighting for Humanity in the Age of the Machine. When I was 15 years old, I thought I had made a monumental philosophical discovery. Late at night, hunched over my old Pentium 4 computer, I wrote my first ever essay, an earnest attempt to reason my way to the ultimate truth. Its central claim was bold, almost blasphemous. Free will cannot possibly exist. The reasoning seemed airtight, at least to my teenage mind. What we call free choice is nothing more than the outcome of causes we didn't choose. My character? I hadn't chosen that. The family I was born into? Not my choice. My environment, genetics, and experiences? All handed to me by forces outside of myself. When a decision appeared before me, it was simply the meeting point of all those factors converging like dominoes falling in sequence. I could say yes or no, but both answers were already determined by everything that had come before. For weeks I walked around in a daze, convinced I had uncovered a truth that should shake the very foundations of human society. I told anyone who would listen, friends at school, family at dinner, and my poor teacher during Bible study. I couldn't fathom why they weren't as shaken by my discovery as I was. Suddenly, all the things I had taken for granted, ideas about right and wrong, heaven and hell, the whole meaning of life, struck me as arbitrary fictions. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing that the ground beneath me had always been an illusion. 3 years later, things got even worse. That's when I learned about the theory of evolution. I devoured everything I could find about Charles Darwin and the scientists who came after him. Darwin himself wrote that publishing his theory felt like confessing a murder, and I totally understood why. As the son of a pastor, I had always believed that there must be a purpose, a goal, an arc to history, that behind all the pain and the chaos, there was a guiding hand, a benevolent force that made life meaningful. But how was I supposed to square that with evolution? With millions of years of endless suffering, of life devouring life? For a while, I grasped at straws. I read a pile of books about intelligent design, but found them unconvincing. I read up on near-death experiences, but had to admit, there was nothing there. I asked friends in church and school how they made sense of what I had learned, but most seemed to prefer not to think about it. And then, one morning, I woke up to a stark realization. I didn't believe anymore. And no, that didn't feel like liberation. It felt like loss, a sense of falling out of a story. I began studying history at university, and with it came a new wave of intellectual influences. I attended a lecture series by Herman Philipsen, a prominent Dutch atheist. He was sharp, witty, relentlessly logical, and at one point he made an offhand remark about the need for intellectual honesty. Everyone, Philipsen said, should have an intellectual hero. I was intrigued. Who would mine be? Back in my student dorm, I began scouting Wikipedia for a candidate. And after a while, I stumbled upon someone who would become a lifelong guide. Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher who lived from 1872 to 1970. There was so much to love about his story. First of all, he was a towering thinker. Russell brought the exactness of mathematics to the big questions of philosophy. Second, I was in awe of his courage. Russell was not just an academic in the ivory tower, he was a public intellectual who acted on his convictions. He campaigned against the First World War, was imprisoned for his pacifism, and became a leading voice for nuclear disarmament. Time and again, he refused to go along with the crowd. When he came to America, Russell was even cancelled. A mother from Brooklyn sued to block his appointment at the City College of New York because she feared he would poison the minds of the young with his atheism and permissive views on sex. The New York Supreme Court agreed and pronounced him morally unfit to teach. This was when Albert Einstein made his famous remark that great spirits have always encountered violent opposition from mediocre minds. Finally, there was the sheer richness of Russell's life. Founder of a progressive school, survivor of a plane crash, winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, author of more than 60 books, 2,000 articles, and 40,000 letters. Russell lived nearly a century, and just before the end, left behind a sprawling 750-page autobiography, as if one life could not contain him. I remember buying a yellowed edition, its pages brittle with age. On the opening leaf, under the heading, "What I Have Lived For," I read the most beautiful words I had ever encountered in English. Russell wrote, "Three passions, simple but overwhelmingly strong, have governed my life. The longing for love, the search for knowledge, and unbearable pity for the suffering of mankind. These passions, like great winds, have blown me hither and thither in a wayward course over a great ocean of anguish, reaching the very verge of despair." As I turned the chapter, I was astonished to discover that Russell had faced the same teenage crisis I once did. At 15, he had also begun questioning free will. He had spent long hours in painful meditation as his faith dissolved, recording his doubts in a secret notebook. Reading those pages, I felt as if I had found a kindred spirit across time, another teenager staring into the abyss. He was gripped by the same mixture of terror and exhilaration at the thought that the world might be utterly different from what he once believed. On my Pentium 4, I opened a curious new website called YouTube, where I found a BBC interview with Russell from 1959. Asked what advice he would give to future generations, he offered two principles, one intellectual, one moral. His intellectual advice was to see the world as it really is, not how you'd like to see it. His moral advice was to tolerate our differences. Or in his words, love is wise, hatred is foolish. Bertrand Russell didn't just echo my teenage doubts. He offered a model for how to live. His writings radiated a radical humanism that was as honest as it was compassionate. Here was a man who had lost his childhood faith, who had faced the void, and who still lived a life overflowing with purpose. He pursued truth with the rigor that reshaped philosophy. He fought for peace with a stubbornness that landed him in prison. He defended freedom even when it cost him his job. He loved, failed, began again, and left behind a body of work that continues to inspire. And in doing so, he revealed a different kind of immortality. Not the denial of death, but the making of a monument out of one's life. I have to confess that when I was first invited to give these lectures, I had never heard of the Reith Lectures. Such are the gaps in one's education as a Dutchman. But you can imagine my awe when I learned that none other than Bertrand Russell delivered the very first series back in 1948. Of course, I had a massive case of imposter syndrome. Who was I to follow in such footsteps? I found some consolation in the fact that even Russell's debut didn't go over smoothly. Lord Reith himself, the BBC's first Director General, wrote in his diary, "Listen to the first Reith lecture by Bertrand Russell. He went far too quickly and has a bad voice. However, I wrote him a civil note. How British. Russell spoke shortly after the horrors of the Second World War and the invention of the atomic bomb. For the first time, humanity had gained the power to destroy itself. Russell stood at a hinge of history, asking what humanity had become and what it might yet be. We too are living at such a moment. Wars are breaking out, democracy is faltering, and once again a revolutionary technology is threatening our very existence. For the first time in history, we are building machines that may rival or even surpass our intelligence. The stakes could hardly be higher. How can we face this moment without the comfort of religion? Ever since I lost my faith, I've wondered what could take its place. Religions all circle around the same 5 questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? How should we live? And what, if anything, is sacred? In all my books, Utopia for Realists, Humankind, and Moral Ambition, I have wrestled with those questions. My whole career has been an effort to find in history what others seek in theology. When I was a teenager, my loss of faith hit me like an earthquake. And I believe our whole culture is now experiencing something similar. Cynicism and apathy are spreading, and people feel betrayed by their elites. The old sources of guidance, faith, community, tradition, are fading away, yet nothing equally powerful has taken their place. We are a culture adrift, searching for meaning, but mostly finding distraction. And that search for meaning has been the thread through these lectures. In the first, I traced our moral decay. I described how liars and cheats climb to the top while honesty and integrity are pushed aside. In the second, I laid out a playbook for redemption, telling the story of the great moral pioneers who came before us. And in the third, I turned their lessons into a program and a plan for our time. If those 3 lectures were a sermon delivered at ground level, the last one looks from above, the God's eye view. Here I want to return to the 5 ancient questions of religion. Let me begin with the first one. Who are we? During my teenage crisis, I thought the answer was grim. Our evolution seemed like a story of endless pain and suffering. But later, in my research, I came to see a different picture, one that is far more hopeful. In my book Humankind, I argued that our real advantage was never being the strongest or even the smartest animal. Instead, we are the product of what scientists call the survival of the friendliest. For thousands of years, it was those best able to cooperate who passed on their genes. The second question then, where did we come from? Well, for hundreds of thousands of years, 95% of our history, we lived as wandering hunter-gatherers. And contrary to the old myth that life was miserable and violent, our societies were remarkably equal, peaceful, and relaxed. Archaeologists have found no evidence of warfare before the rise of civilization. But then we made, as the great scholar Jared Diamond wrote in 1987, the worst mistake in the history of the human race. I remember reading his essay as a student and being in awe of the power of his argument. Farming, Diamond showed, was a disaster. With fields and fences came hierarchy and kings, wars and slavery. If the long era of foraging had been a story of equality, the age of farming became a story of oppression. Some theologians even suspect that the story of the fall in the Old Testament was an attempt to make sense of that loss, the moment when paradise was plowed under. And yet, history did not end there. After millennia of backbreaking poverty, humanity found a way out, the Industrial Revolution. For the first time, ordinary people could escape subsistence. We invented machines that amplified our powers, produced vast new wealth, and extended our lifespans. Since 1750, we've been living through the Great Acceleration. Energy use, population, and emissions have all followed an exponential curve. We are reshaping the Earth at breakneck speed. And yet, beneath it all, we remain the same old species. We are apes with godlike powers. Which brings me to the third question. Where are we going? Ask the CEOs of the big tech companies and they'll tell you that the rise of artificial intelligence is 100 times bigger than the Industrial Revolution. That this may be the last invention we'll ever make. We are currently in a race to create alien minds, systems that we do not understand and that we may not be able to control. They are not designed so much as summoned into being. And so we must ask, will this be the new worst mistake in the history of the human race? Well, the omens are not good. Just look at what the first wave of big tech has already done to us. Literacy and numeracy rates are plummeting. Teenage depression, anxiety, and suicide attempts are rising. Face-to-face socializing is collapsing as we retreat indoors, eyes glued to the screens, and solitude is becoming the hallmark of our age. The bleakest number I've seen is that American teenagers now spend 70% less time hosting or attending parties than in 2003, when I was 15. 70%. Social media promised connection and community, but what it delivered was isolation and outrage. On Instagram, people spend more than 90% of their time watching videos from people they don't know. And platforms reward those who are loudest, angriest, and most extreme. Or, as a recent study in Nature concluded, those with both high psychopathy and low cognitive ability are the most actively involved in online political engagement. This is not survival of the friendliest anymore. It's survival of the shameless. So, as our very humanity is under attack, the fourth question presses itself upon us. How should we live? Unsurprisingly, I believe we can find the answer in our past. In my previous lectures, I spoke about two moral revolutions of the 19th century: the fight against slavery and the struggle for women's rights. But I didn't mention the third one yet: temperance. Many abolitionists and suffragettes were also temperance activists. This movement is largely forgotten nowadays, but it holds vital lessons for us. Back then, alcohol was not a casual indulgence, but a social catastrophe. There were no warning labels, no age restrictions, no limits on advertising. Saloons dotted every street corner, wages disappeared into the bottle, and families were torn apart by violence and neglect. The alcohol industry profited from human weakness while devastating entire communities. And that is why people rose against it. The temperance movement was one of the largest democratic movements in history, led by women and workers. They believed that real freedom meant being fully present, to choose connection over compulsion. They saw addiction for what it is, the moment when the power of choice no longer exists. And so they demanded radical measures: higher taxes, stricter licensing, and even total prohibition. Today we face a new addiction industry, not of wine and whiskey, but of apps and algorithms. Many of our brightest minds are building a single great Moloch, an attention hijacking machine that devours our focus, steals our time, and leaves us emptier by the hour. And AI threatens to supercharge it all. But here's my warning to Silicon Valley. You are awakening a dragon. Public anger is steering, and it could grow into a movement as fierce and unstoppable as the temperance crusade a century ago. Poll after poll finds that people across the West think AI will worsen almost everything they care about, from our health and relationships to our jobs and democracies. By a 3-to-1 margin, people want more regulation. History shows how this movement could be ignited by a small group of citizens and how powerful it could become. Just as Bertrand Russell led mass protests against the nuclear arms race, we may soon see mass resistance to the AI arms race. A century ago, temperance activists even managed to push a constitutional amendment through Congress to ban alcohol altogether. Now, those who want to avoid provoking something equally drastic should learn from the past. This brings me to the final question. What is sacred? At this hinge of history, what should we defend and expand above all else? Just like Russell, I believe the answer is not to be found in the heavens, but here on earth, in our own human nature. The longing for love is sacred. The search for knowledge is sacred. The unbearable pity for the suffering of mankind is sacred. And so are the small things. Laughter and song, the bonds of friendship, the joy of play, the wonder of art, the beauty of nature, the gift of attention. All of humanity is sacred. That's the revelation that flows from our history. We are not fallen sinners. We are rising apes. The real meaning of the human adventure is not to be found in the heavens, but in the future we can build together. This is also where my youthful denial of free will comes full circle. When I was 15, it felt like staring into the void. If nobody is really in control, what's left of morality? But over time, I've reached the opposite conclusion. If our lives are shaped by history, by forces we never chose, then the whole idea of what people deserve falls apart. Of course, you can see this most plainly in addiction. When someone loses the ability to choose, blaming them does nothing. Saying there is no free will does not weaken morality. It makes it stronger. It breaks down the walls of pride and status that separate us and widens our moral circle. I'm reminded of the Quakers, the small sect of quiet dissenters that played a leading role in the fight against slavery. They believed in that of God in everyone, an inner light that shone equally in every human being. To them, slavery was not just cruel, it was a desecration of the sacred. And I believe that the struggle over what is sacred is the defining struggle of our time. Powerful voices on the right insist that what matters most is loyalty to one's tribe, to one's soil, to one's kind. They speak as if love were a scarce resource, something to be hoarded rather than shared. They imagine that tightening the moral circle makes our compassion stronger. But the opposite is true. Real gratitude does not shrink the circle of love. It enlarges it. The people who built the great moral movements of the past, the abolitionists, the suffragettes, the civil rights leaders, were not less devoted to their families or countries. They were more so. The British abolitionists who ended the slave trade made their country greater. And the American civil rights campaigners who took down segregation brought the nation closer to its creed. They were the true patriots. This was also the spirit in which I was raised. My parents taught me that compassion does not stop at the border of family or nation. Over time, I discovered that beneath the differences of language and ritual, we shared the same convictions. To be honest, I've long since lost interest in debates of belief versus unbelief. And I've also lost the certainty of my youthful atheism. Yes, theism still seems unlikely to me. But what once felt like clarity has given way to a deeper kind of agnosticism. Not indifference, but awe at how much we do not, cannot, and perhaps don't even have to know. What matters, I think, is not what people believe, but what they do. A tree is known by its fruit. Again, I'm reminded of the abolitionists. This movement was a fusion of Christian compassion with the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality. It was the pulpit and the pamphlet, the inner light and the natural right. Together, they toppled one of humanity's oldest and cruelest institutions. What I have tried to do in these lectures is to use history as a compass, to show how decadence can end in renewal, how moral revolutions happen, and how the future depends on what we hold sacred. The whole series has been a meditation on determinism and freedom, necessity and contingency, history and agency. And this is the heart of my secular religion. Two ways of seeing the world. When we look at others, we should see the causes behind their actions, the history, the luck, the wounds they never chose, and respond with understanding rather than blame. But when we look in the mirror, we should recognize our freedom to act. As Kierkegaard said, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. So let us throw ourselves fully into the task. We know it will not be easy. The future holds no guarantees, no certainty that our species will endure or that our story will end well. But that has always been the human condition. What we do know is this: again and again, small groups of committed citizens have bent the arc of history towards justice. And whatever the outcome, there is beauty in the trying. Beauty in every act of courage, in every spark of truth, in every rich and well-rounded life. We cannot build monuments in stone that last forever, but we can build monuments in time.